So, here's the deal. At the time of writing this script, the first semi-final of Eurovision 2018 was mere weeks away, and by the time this video was originally planned to hit Patreon, both semi-finals would be over and the final would be imminent, and by the time I've actually finished producing this whole shebang, never mind when it reaches the general public on YouTube, which may be you lovely people, I don't know, hello, Eurovision 2018 as a whole will be entirely over, so at the writing stage of the script, it seemed to me to be a wise idea to do a Eurovision video just for this month that doesn't rely on data that's absolutely subject to change within the next couple of days, weeks, or hours at the time of writing, and where better to look for Eurovision non-startery than Turkey. Hold on, don't get too offended and click off just yet, I'm actually going somewhere with this. Roll the opening titles. Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, and granted, Turkey do have their own history at actual Eurovision to look at, but that's a story for another video entirely. No indeed, today we'll be looking at what Turkey did after they abandoned Eurovision in 2013, a little passion project of the Turkish broadcaster that took the form of the Turkvision Song Contest. Yes, that is a real thing. Let's take a step back for a moment though. You might not have heard of this odd little beast, which speaks volumes to be perfectly candid, but whatever. So, to get you up to speed, well, I suppose we ought to open with the fast facts, as we usually do. Based directly on the Eurovision format, unsurprisingly, Turkvision was a song contest created by TÜRKSOY, the international organisation of Turkic culture, which is abbreviated to TÜRKSOY because Turkish language. Consequently, that means that it was open to not just countries, but regions within countries, provided they had sufficient Turkish heritage, leading to the participation, or the planned participation as the case may be, from Germany, Sweden, Austria, Moldova, Gagauzia, and the Chinese province of Xinjiang, amongst others. I hope I said that right. The whole project was spearheaded by TMB TV, that's Turkish Music Box Television, or Türk Müzik Birliği in its native Turkish. They remained in charge of producing the contest for its entire run, for better or for worse. The first edition was directed by one Ismet Zatov, who remained in an executive position for the years that followed, so I guess whatever he was doing well. And more power to him, I suppose. Now, that being said, we can't overlook the obvious elephant in the room here. Turkvision lasted 3 editions and then died an absolute death. Kind of an asterisk to that point, they are sort of reviving the cancelled 2016/17 edition in 2018, so maybe it's not completely dead, but that doesn't really negate anything that I say in this video though, but still, Or maybe it didn't, but we'll come back to that in a moment. The first edition was held in 2013, as planned. Azerbaijan won, everything was cool. The 2014 edition followed, and Kazakhstan won, and everything continued to be fine. The 2015 edition was a little bit shakier, but Kyrgyzstan won that and everything still seemed to be okay, but whatever. It was in 2016 when everything started to unravel, and we're going to take a closer look now to try and work out exactly why that happened, and if it wasn't inevitable from the start, and if it is going to rise from the ashes after all, which remains a distinct possibility at this point. We'll just have to see. I will say, as a foreigner with no Turkish heritage whatsoever and living in a country that would never have been eligible to take part in the first place, I found the Turkvision contest fascinating for a number of reasons. If nothing else, it was an opportunity to see a showcase of nations, regions, cultures, identities, and flags with which I wasn't familiar, all tied together by songs. So in other words, to me, it was like experiencing Eurovision for the very first time, except I was happy to keep an open mind about it because literally why would you criticize this as a format? So what more is there to say? The contest was created in 2013, as we know, but why? It followed off the back of their withdrawal from Eurovision after finishing 7th in the 2012 contest, so it would be a safe bet that whatever made them withdraw is what spurred them into crossing the line so hard that they brought an entirely new contest into existence to compensate. Some sources claim that at least part of the reason was their failure to qualify in 2011 with the band Yüksek Sadakat and Live It Up, which sort of doesn't explain why they took part again the following year and finished in the top 10 before finally filing the paperwork necessary to pull out of that and pull into Turkvision. The other leading explanation, one that seems much more plausible, is that the Turkish delegation were dissatisfied with the Big Five's benefits within Eurovision. That is to say, Spain, Italy, Germany, the United Kingdom and France have all always had an automatic pass into the final since semi-finals were formally introduced in 2004, because those 5 countries contribute significantly more to the financing of the contest. If that's true, then the Turkish delegation seems to share the same dismissal of that as a lot of onlookers of the contest. But the truth is, the Big Five each individually contribute so much to the contest financially that if they didn't take part, the contest would be forced to downsize significantly. There's a reason why the contest stage looked so impressive following Italy's return in 2011. And yet, Turkey thinks that the countries who keep the contest alive by their own generosity don't deserve any bonus perks. Whatever, Turkey. Well, what's your solution then? Well, to find our answer to that, let's take a step back again and look at the format as a whole. For all the spite that Turkey seemed to harbour for Eurovision when they developed the contest, Turkvision does bear surprising similarities to its supposed rival. I mean, it was a score-based singing contest between competing regions celebrating their respective cultures. Sounds pretty Eurovision to me. In fact, no fewer than 44 countries and regions at least expressed an interest in participating in the first 3 editions, even if 11 of them never made it to the contest before it was canned, but in all fairness, 6 of those potential debutants missed participating specifically because it was cancelled in 2016, because they had signed up to be on the list for the ill-fated 2016 edition. Naturally, with such high levels of interest, semi-finals would become a necessity from the word go, and, luckily for Turkey, they had taken part in Eurovision long enough to see the rise and emergence of the humble semi-final live and in person, so they knew that that was absolutely the way to go to deal with this problem, rather than some sort of twisted kwalifikacja za Eskişehir or whatever. So that worked out for them at least. The only issue there is that while the organisers understood the need for a semi-final stage, they didn't seem to understand what purpose it was meant to serve. Consequently, for the 2 editions to feature a qualifying round, instead of having the participants split into 2 or more pools for more than one show, so that each semi-final and the final would feature a different spread of participating songs, they just had 1 semi-final per year. And because Turkey hated the idea of auto-qualifiers so much, nobody was pre-qualified for the final, not even the host country or region. And I'm sure you can see the problem with that immediately. That's right, 1 semi-final and no auto-qualifiers. So what was the point of having a final? I literally cannot fathom a single reason as to why they would bother having a semi-final featuring every competing entry, from which some songs would qualify, only to be voted on by literally all of the same juries a second time. In what universe is that not totally redundant? And this also meant that the semi-final would run substantially longer than the final, so the semi-final round for both years of its inclusion outshone the main event in every way, which is ludicrous to say the least. And yet, somehow, the inevitable didn't happen. Granted, the full results of the 2013 semi-final were never disclosed, but in 2014, the songs that placed first, second and third in the semi-final finished second, last, and first in the final in that same order. How did that happen? I mean, as if it isn't suspect by itself that a song could come second in the semi-final only to tank to 15th out of 15 in the final, but of the remaining top 2, how did they swap, and by an almost identical margin? No, really, I'm not casting aspersions, I'm genuinely lost here. Maybe it had something to do with the voting. After all, unlike Eurovision, Turkvision never featured phone voting, though it was on their list of to-dos to include in the contest eventually. But for as long as it ran, it was 100% jury-based. Each participating country or region sent 1 professional juror each, and they would award 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 points to their top 10 favourite entries of the contest. So it was basically a 100% jury version of Eurovision, but with 9 and 10 point units instead of the 10 and 12 point system made famous by OG Eurovision. Why the change? Well, either the EBU has a patent on giving points in units of 12, which they don't, because they give 12 points in Melodifestivalen 2, amongst others, or Turkey was just that adamant about being so different. So that's all well and good, but it doesn't really explain the discrepancy in 2014. Not that it matters, I suppose, it could just be that the performance between the semis and the final were that different and that much better or worse to merit the change, in which case, fair enough. So the semi-final system is to blame instead. But I am getting off topic here. It really does feel, as a foreigner looking in from the outside, as though the whole Turkvision format was developed almost entirely out of spite first, which then turned into Turkic pride later down the line, which is that much more wholesome, but still. So I can't help but feel that if the contest really was developed from a place of spite and nothing but, well then how could it not have been doomed from the start? Well, I think that would be oversimplifying it a bit. In fact, I think it would be a bit childish to blame the contest's failure entirely on spite. After all, that's just the spark that brought the contest to life in the first place. Provided that it was kept going well enough, there's no reason why it shouldn't have flourished, especially with a cultural heritage as broad, rich and proud as its Turkic heritage to draw from for inspiration and to appeal to as an audience. But alas, no amount of historical pride can overturn poor organisational management. There's no nice way of saying this. For as lovely as an idea as Turkvision was, the organisation and delivery of it was an utter shambles, which is an especial shame given how much heart went into hosting it, especially on Kazakhstan's part, but that's not to undersell how much effort Turkey brought to the table when conceiving the show. Still though, there's no escaping some of the glaring organisational holes in the whole thing. For one, the contest was so poorly advertised to most of the world. Like, the leading reason that most of the world took any interest in the inaugural edition at all was only because the broadcaster made such a big deal out of saying, "Hey, we don't like Eurovision, so we're making our own, okay?" But beyond that, it just wasn't advertised. Like, at all. Granted, that makes sense, to an extent. Obviously, to any country lacking Turkic heritage in any meaningful way, the whole thing would seem extremely esoteric, so those countries wouldn't have much interest in watching anyway, and if they did, the hosts might have felt pressured to present in English as well as Turkish, much like how Eurovision is presented in English and French at the moment. And letting English in would sort of defeat the purpose of putting Turkic culture front and centre, so that's fair enough. Besides, with the contest being of minimal cultural interest to anyone outside of the Turkic heritage region, they most likely wouldn't have seen a financial return on their investment in a worldwide broadcast anyway. And besides that, it might almost have come across as delusional, that they were taking the assumption that their success was such a foregone conclusion that of course they would garner worldwide viewership. So their decision to stay away from worldwide broadcasting or advertising almost makes sense. Almost. The problem is, you could argue the same thing in the opposite direction as well, really. I mean, in a sense, what logic is there to going to the trouble of organising a dedicated and passionate showcase of Turkic culture, only to tell people of non-Turkic heritage that they don't deserve to watch the show, so they can focus on, effectively, preaching to the choir, the very, very Turkic choir? You could argue that people with a direct connection to the culture on display would appreciate it more, and that's fair enough. But it feels like a woeful waste of an opportunity to educate the rest of the world about what makes your culture so rich and worthwhile in the first place. To turn the whole situation into a sensationalized soundbite, the act of keeping the whole thing so prohibitively poorly advertised turns what was a nice idea for a showcase of history and heritage into one protracted act of excessive, narcissistic cultural masturbation. It goes from showing the world how impressive your culture is to shutting the door and saying to yourself, "I am so great, I am so great," to an audience of just your own family who have already heard this 1,000 times before. But let's be clear, I don't resent the contest for doing this, and I do understand their reasoning. But, as an outsider, it does look, at best, a bit inconsiderate. Aside from it not really having much of an internationally accessible online presence though, I think the biggest flaw in their organisation was never having consistency for the shows. The dates, for one. Sure, I mean, the first few editions were held in December or November, and following reasons beyond the organisers' control, the last edition to date was rescheduled for August, but those were exceptional circumstances, so I'll let that one slide. But still, it very much seemed as though the dates were pulled out of nowhere at the last possible minute during the organising process every year. Compare and contrast actual Eurovision, where we know for certain almost a year in advance the exact days on which the next contest will take place. The other consistency issue comes in the form of the location. Granted, the first edition was scheduled to take place in Eskişehir, and that never changed. In fact, the idea was for the contest to always be held in that year's official Turkish capital of culture. Again, nice idea, but it derailed pretty quickly. In 2015, the host city was originally announced as being Mari, Turkmenistan, but before too long it was moved to the nation's capital, Ashgabat, instead. But even that didn't stick, and it was moved yet again to Istanbul. And it would be fair to presume that this logistical nightmare would come with implications for the dates of the contest too, but I'm not going to continue flogging that dead horse. 1 year later, they decided that Istanbul did such a good job the previous year that they should host again, but that plan went down after the 2016 bombings of the city. In that regard, delaying the contest and moving the contest both individually made sense. Doing both at the same time seemed a bit extra, but whatever. Anyway, hosting it was handed over to Kazakhstan, and it was to be held in the capital, Astana, in August of the following year. Obviously, that never happened, although the 2018 revival of the 2017 revival of the 2016 contest is still scheduled to be held in that same venue, so kinda worked out in the end. Now, obviously, the organisers do genuinely deserve sympathy on the part of that last point, because terrorist attacks under any circumstances are not the fault of the city that suffers them, and that extends to the broadcaster and the organisers as well, so rescheduling only made sense in that case. But everything else, from the constantly fluctuating hosts and dates to the lack of advertisement of the contest, almost looking like a lack of pride in the contest, almost looking like they were just going through the motions of hosting it rather than doing it out of passion, made it prohibitively esoteric for any non-participant country to even bother taking note. Wow. It's almost as if Turkey came up with Turkvision during a hissy fit only to realise that being a parent to an international music event isn't as easy as they thought after all. That being said, it would only be fair to give due attention to the fact that Turkey isn't the only one to have tried and failed in this regard. I mean, yes, they did also try introducing Bala Turkvision, a Turkvision counterpart to Junior Eurovision, in 2015, which only lasted one edition before also being cancelled. Well, they did plan a 2016 edition, but that got delayed too and then cancelled thereafter, and that's beside the point at this stage. Unsurprisingly, Turkvision isn't the first, and probably won't be the last, experimental international song contest format made to rival Eurovision. For instance, there were the ABU TV and radio song festivals for the Asia-Pacific region, and, well, those didn't really die, actually. One had to be cancelled because the King of Thailand had died while they were the host nation, and the other is actually still going every other year to this day, so they're not all doomed to failure just because they're not Eurovision. There's also the Sopot International Music Festival. Granted, this was never really meant to oppose Eurovision in any meaningful way, it was just a festival of music from multiple countries with a winner being announced at the end for the best. This one didn't die so much as gently fall into a coma in 2014, with room for a revival in the near future, maybe just because the Sopot Festival has several blips like this throughout its history. It did, however, spark the Intervision Song Contest, which was intended to be, in its own words, the Eastern Bloc's answer to Eurovision, featuring post-Soviet countries and member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It ran for 4 years between 1977 and 1980, and then stopped, and then they brought it back in 2008, which went well, and then it died again. Then the Russian broadcaster tried to revive it again, supposedly as an act of spite towards Conchita winning Eurovision 2014. The phrase moral decay of the West was thrown around a bit when that was being arranged, but I'm not going to point fingers with that. The point is, only 7 countries signed up, and only one act was actually chosen to compete, Alexander Ivan Ivanov, who would go on to represent Belarus at Eurovision not too long after. But with so little interest in the revival, this too fell through. This just leaves Germany's Bundesvision Song Contest, and predictably, because it didn't exist to oppose Eurovision but rather to celebrate the format and to apply it to the Bundesländer of Germany, it lasted much longer. It was masterminded by the legendary Stefan Raab, you know, the host from 2011 and the guy who came 5th for Germany in the year 2000 with the song Vada Hada Duda Da. Absolute tune, by the way, but time and a place. Anyway, Bundesvision, which was 100% public vote throughout, albeit on a premium rate phone line, but whatever, lasted for a steady 11 editions from 2005 to 2015, and honestly, it isn't especially clear why it ended. Ask a German, I guess? This isn't to say that every spin-off fails, of course. Of the Eurovision family of events, the Junior Eurovision Song Contest, the Eurovision Young Dancers, the Young Musicians, and Choir of the Year all thrived, which stands Eurovision Asia in good stead to succeed too. That said, let's take a moment of silence to remember the ill-fated Eurovision Dance Contest, consciously killed off for the simple reason that dance-off competitions stopped being popular internationally after about 2008. Okay, on to the conclusion. The point to all of this is this. Don't try to make your own Eurovision unless you're willing to see it through. Granted, if your spin-off is made with the EBU's blessing and or support, you're much more likely to succeed, and if you're making your own contest out of spite, as a middle finger to the Eurovision format, you're much more likely to go down in flames because you're trying to prove a point, rather than because you actually want to host a contest and understand how it's done. So, that being said, I'm not going to assign a rank to Turkvision, partly because doing so might spark an international incident, but mostly just because this little video essay is more about what we can learn from Turkvision's rise and fall more than anything else. The main takeaway here is that hosting an international contest of any kind is not to be done lightly. If you're doing it from a place of spite, your intentions are never going to be in the right place to begin with, and you're hundreds of times more likely to be doomed to failure as a result. So how can that be avoided? Simple. Make sure you have a total and absolute understanding of what makes Eurovision work, and so well, and to such great effect, before you try to criticize it by making something better that falls at the first hurdle. It's not as easy as you think, and people never seem to learn. Basically, in short, sinners, glass houses, etc, etc. Having said all of this though, there is one point that stands in contention to all of the above. Literally, as I was writing the script for this video, Bosnia and Herzegovina chose their representative for the cancelled edition of Turkvision, so maybe it's not dead after all? I mean, Wikipedia reckons that it's back on, and it's going to be held in Astana, and somewhere between 42 and 44 countries and regions are going to take part, albeit with some of them being represented by songs that were chosen 2 years ago at this point, but whatever. Still, the whole thing sort of undermines the point of this video, kind of, but it doesn't change what we can learn from Turkvision's rise and fall just the same, and I will own that. We're here to learn, not to criticise. Nevertheless though, I've said my piece, so all that remains is for me to bid you a sincere round of thanks, particularly if you happen to be one of the lovely people supporting me over on patreon.com/TessHex. And if not, don't worry, I do still appreciate your viewership. You make this worthwhile for me. If you want to see these videos 1 month sooner though, and get a whole load of perks and benefits besides, then you can pledge as little as $1 per video to get started on that, supporting me and being part of the reason why these videos actually happen to begin with. But of course, the decision is entirely yours. Either way, as always, I have been and will continue to be Tessellating Hexagons, and I thank you once again for watching, especially if you happen to be Turkish and thus very offended at my point of view. Well, if you are indeed still watching, thanks, and see you in the next one. If I'm still alive by then, please don't hurt me, Turkey.